In this video, we're going to continue our discussion. Last time we started with our introduction to the brain at the small pieces, the neuron. We're going to work our way up into the larger structures that play a role in the brain. We're going to talk a little bit about the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system. We're going to talk about the brain and a guy I've heard about, you might have too, named Phineas Gage, and what he taught us about how the brain kind of works, even when we might lose parts of it. And then we're going to talk about those little messengers that go between one neuron and another. We call them neurotransmitters. And then the last piece that we're going to touch on is the endocrine system, because that's that whole message system outside of the brain that helps us function. That's where we're headed with this lecture. So the two key parts are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And if you think about it, what is the central nervous system? Well, the central nervous system is going to be the brain working all the way down into the spinal cord. So it goes down through this part of the brain and into the entire spinal cord. That's how it keeps us working from the central nervous system. But it attaches to our peripheral nervous system. That is all the nerves that go out from the brain into our extremities that are helping from the bottom of the brain and the spinal cord out into fingers and toes and knees and all of those components. Within this peripheral nervous system, we have a somatic nervous system and an autonomic nervous system. Within the autonomic nervous system, we have a sympathetic nervous system also. All of these work together. The somatic nervous system is the component that helps us understand our sensories. So soma means body, and when we're thinking about a somatic nervous system, it's all those messages from outside our eyes, our ears, our taste, our fingers, and our hearing, all of those that get messages sent to the brain to be interpreted. That's where the sensory and motor information works in communication with the brain. The autonomic nervous system is the component of the brain that keeps us breathing, our heart pumping, and all of the components that keep this whole soma working and functioning. So it's a combination of glands and organs working together. The sympathetic nervous system within that is that fight or flight component. It's the one that turns on the neurotransmitters that send out the messages in our hormones to say, get ready, we have to pay attention, something's about to happen, and we need to know how to respond. Those are all of the large systems that keep us functioning on a day-to-day basis. The brain, wow, this isn't a real brain. This guy needs his brain back before we finish today. But the brain is composed of all sorts of interconnected neurons and glial cells. The glial cells are the part that hold and cushion all of the nerves. And the nerve cells are the part that send those messages, both within the brain system and external. So when we think about this, we can think of a bunch of lobes and halves. The first part we want to understand is that there's two sides. There's a right side and a left side. And these two sides play different roles. In fact, the right side is controlling the left side of your body, and the left side of your brain is controlling the right side of your body. Now, sometimes we hear about being a right-brained individual or a left-brained individual, and that is actually a myth. There is no such thing as that. You use your whole brain. You actually see a lot of communication between the brain. In fact, this is part of where you get that communication. This is the corpus callosum, and it's a connector where those messages go between the right and the left side of the brain. When we look at the brain, we actually have a forebrain, a midbrain, and a hindbrain. And the different components related to that is the forebrain is where that higher level functioning that humans bring to our operation takes place. It's that outer layer, it's the frontal lobe. As we go to the midbrain, those are the components that keep us protected. That's our emotional emotional system that helps us understand information that's coming on into our brain and helps us add meaning and decision making to the process. In In the bottom part of our brain, the core, right before the brainstem starts coming out of the brain, is the hindbrain. And this is the part that we share the most with other creatures. This is the primitive component that helps us understand how to do fight or flight at an automatic response level without any thinking, and how to keep our body alive. So these are the components, the general components that make up the brain. There are 4 lobes related to the cerebral cortex. The frontal lobe is where the consciousness thought takes place. The other areas have aspects related to emotion, reasoning, language, and memory. Also, the occipital lobe in the back is where most of the vision processing is going to take place. Certainly the parietal lobes are processes that manage language, and that's both the receptive language and the expressive language. We have at the top, going all the way over, our sensory band that helps us understand all of the messages that are coming from all of our senses. And you would be surprised at how much of the brain is actually allocated to touch and to vision. Those are some of our primary sensory information gathering systems. Other aspects of the brain are going to be the thalamus, which is a relay center in the brain, the hypothalamus, which is the component that's set up to keep us in homeostasis, thinking about temperature, knowing when we need to sleep, when we need to eat, all of those components that help us as a bodily system keep going on a daily basis. Additionally, there's glands in the brain. The pituitary gland is the master gland. It's the gland that runs the endocrine system, and the endocrine system is the one that sends out all of the messages that keep us growing or keep us effective in managing stressors and other health-related components. The limbic system is a system of different structures within the brain that is a part of helping us store memories and manage our emotions. So as I mentioned, there's a sensory cortex strip that goes across. There's also a motor cortex, and that's where all the messages that are sent out to keep your different limbs moving, your eyes moving in terms of blinking. So there's the receptor, and then there's the motor components that are tied to those areas that cross from one side to the other. The Broca's area is actually in the parietal. On the right-hand side, there's a component actually right above your ear, and that's the language center that helps particularly with production of language. When there's any damage in this area, that's where an individual will be having difficulty forming words that are articulate. Sometimes I wonder about my own Broca's area, since I cannot say things accurately. The prefrontal cortex is the component in your frontal lobe, and that part of your brain is set up to help you with the higher level thinking. The what if I do this? Should I do this? It's the part that really separates us from children and adults. This is where most of the development happens as we grow after we're born. This is where we get our personality and the other components. They are shaped here. So when you've been taught that you need to wear your helmet when you take a bicycle ride, what they're really saying is control that component. While all of your brain is important, this is the part that makes you you. And we want you controlling that as much as possible. There's a guy I mentioned that you should know about. His name was Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was working on the railroad, and this is back in the 1800s in the United States. He was actually a foreman of his team, and they were building the railroad. And he was known as a good manager. He was well liked by his crew. He was able to get things done, and they saw him as a good leader in that capacity. One day, something went awry, and he had a large tamping rod that blew up and went straight through his occipital space right here and through the front of his brain. Ultimately, he lost the use of this eye, and he lost sections of his frontal lobe. Now, you would think that this would cause somebody to die, but Phineas Gage didn't die. In fact, he went and was seen by his physician, and the physician was shocked to find that he was functioning and couldn't believe that the story about the injury was accurate, until he looked closer and realized that part of brain tissue was actually coming out of his skull. They did help him, he did heal, but when he went back to work, he wasn't able to function at the same level. He could still work on the railroad, but he couldn't do the managerial skills because those components were no longer accessible in his brain. He ended up getting into conflict a little more readily than he had before, and he was not seen as nearly as amiable. His friends at the time said, "This is not the Phineas Gage that we know." Now, that is an astounding story that someone could have such a huge damage to their brain and still function. But what we learned from Phineas's story is that so much of what made Phineas Phineas is right in the frontal lobe. And that's true for you and me. The temporal lobe is a very important part of the brain. Actually, all the parts of the brain are very important. In the temporal lobe, we have more auditory information. This is the part that's right behind the ear. And these components are the part that translate information into meaning for you. The auditory cortex is located in that lobe, and so is Wernicke's area. In this area back here, Broca's is right up here. That's the part that makes the meaning making a challenge. But back here, Wernicke's was having difficulty understanding. Broca's is having difficulty forming the words. What we do know is that there's a part in the brain that helps us to understand language at a very specific site area in the brain, and not just the whole of the brain. However, the brain gets used in all sorts of ways in every activity we do. So it's not just that we need this section or this section for an activity, but there are primary areas that are responsible for primary activities. We mentioned the thalamus earlier. The thalamus is part of the brain that processes most of the senses except for smell. And the reason that smell doesn't go through the thalamus is that the organ related to that is right next to the brain, so it can kind of short circuit. In fact, what we do know is that smell has some of the strongest impact and memories for us because it is so close to the parts of the brain that work with us. The thalamus, though, is the organ, the structure in the brain that helps us to process all of those messages related to our senses. Then there's the limbic system. The limbic system is made up of the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. The amygdala is the structure in the brain that gives us that, should I react or shouldn't I? So if we see a snake, the amygdala has been able to recognize there is something. And then the hippocampus is part of what gives us memories related to that. So they work together so that the hippocampus says, oh my gosh, that's that thing we should be afraid of. And the amygdala sends the messages into the brain to go respond with some fear. The hypothalamus is the part of the limbic system that keeps the whole of the system working well in terms of body temperature, appetite, and blood pressure. Now, why is all this information important? Because there are some disorders or some issues that we recognize with individuals where they may have trouble with their appetite or with their body temperature or with blood pressure. And recognizing how to manage those more effectively or where damage might be in the brain can help us to support these individuals in moderating the impact of those issues. The hindbrain is the very back underside of the brain. And the reason that we want to understand the hindbrain and the structures that are there, the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum are all components that continue that control over blood pressure, breathing, and heart rate. Now, all of those also work together to keep us balanced so that when you have any kind of injury at that level, you can see individuals having trouble with stabilization or how they walk. So there can be damage in those areas. If you've ever known somebody who has some shakes, maybe they have Parkinson's, some of what we see is damage in those areas for those individuals. So we talked about the neuron. Remember our neuron? The neuron, the soma, this is the axon that sends the messages. And here are the dendrites, the receiving components of those messages. Well, one of the things we want to understand is that as this axon goes out, it's going to be partnering up with another neuron, and they're going to communicate with each other. So we have this neuron and this neuron, but they don't touch. There's a little tiny space between them that's called the synaptic cleft. And in that, there is a space for what we call neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters actually are the messengers from one neuron to another neuron. And it happens so swiftly, you don't notice at all. That's the component that we want to understand at a neurotransmitter level, because there's many different kinds of neurotransmitters that are part of that messaging system, and each one plays a different role in how we function. So what starts that whole component is in the cell, there's this excitation that's happening. It's kind of this buildup of sodium components and pressure that sends that message out. We talk about that in terms of action potential. The message goes out down the axon, goes out to the edge, and out to that point where the neurotransmitters get put into the synaptic cleft. What's going on the other side of that synaptic cleft is there's a neuron with the receiving dendrites, and there's almost a lock and key system. So what we have in that space is that there are neurotransmitters that may have the right kind of structure that fits into the receptor on the other side. Think of it as a round shape coming in and trying to find the round shape to press into like a key. However, if it finds a triangle or if it finds a square, it's not going to be able to keep that message going down through that next nerve cell. So it has to find the right receptor for the right shape that's coming over here. And then what happens is it sends the message, and then the receptor releases it back into the synaptic cleft, and the neuron on the other side will reuptake those neurotransmitters so that the next time that excitatory potential comes along, it's ready to do that same kind of process of sending out signals. So different types of neurons release different types of neurotransmitters. It's like they've got specialization. In fact, they do have specialization in the messages that get sent, because all of our neurons are trained into that. In fact, we're born with more brain cells than we need. When we're born, we have all these neurons, but we don't need all of them. What we need is them trained into specific skills. So what happens when you get a brand new child is they don't know how to speak yet. They may work their way into babbling, but as they refine their skills, what they are doing is actually training the pathways through these neurons that help them to know the specifics. We actually call the removal of the extra neurons pruning. We prune away the unnecessary neurons in the brain so that we have the necessary ones without any interference in the process. So some of the neurotransmitters that work in our systems are acetylcholine, dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Acetylcholine is the one that's part of helping us have muscle action and memory. We need that to help us be able to work on a daily basis. Endorphin is another one you might think of related to that. Endorphin is that one that gives us energy and pleasure. So if you're out running and you go long enough, your body is able to release these endorphins to say, this was a good thing. Along with that is dopamine. Dopamine and endorphins work together. Dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter, and it also adds to that sense of pleasure and reward in activities. Norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter that keeps your body, your intestines, and your alertness. These have multiple different roles that they play, but they all work with our neural pathways in our brains and then out into the message system. Final one to know about is serotonin. Serotonin is a core component in how we manage our moods and sleep. What we do know is that when you are sleep deprived, you tend to get irritable. So you think about that. Serotonin is a part of saying, hey, it's time to go to sleep now. It's helping your body know how to take good care of yourself so that you can have your best abilities moving forward and a good mood to keep motivated in the activities that are ahead of you. That takes us to the endocrine system. Endocrine system is those hormones outside of our body, and you probably are familiar with some of these components. Remember, the pituitary gland is the granddaddy of them all. This is the master gland in your brain, and it's the one that's managing the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland, your gonads, and your pancreas. All of these are working together, responding to messages that say, hey, we need to up the activity here, or we need to reduce the activity. So you are every day working with your endocrine system, working with your neurons to function in how you understand what's going on, even in this video. Recognize that your brain structures and your nerves, your neurons in your system are helping you to move, to engage in activities with others, to find pleasure at a neurotransmitter level, and to understand who you are and where you're headed in life. This is the core of neuroscience and how we understand how we can take good care of what's going on here or make interventions when necessary.